You know what's interesting about awakening? It changes everything. The way you see the world, the way you understand yourself, the way you spend your time. But perhaps nothing changes more dramatically than who you choose to be with. Because once you've woken up, once you've seen through the illusions that most people live by, you can't unsee it. And you certainly can't share your life with someone who's still asleep, who's still playing the games, who's still lost in the performance. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been with someone who looked perfect on paper? Attractive, successful, all the right qualities. But something was missing, something you couldn't quite name, a depth, a presence, an awareness. And no matter how good everything looked on the surface, you felt fundamentally alone. That's what happens when you're awake and they're not. You're speaking different languages, living in different realities, and no amount of attraction or compatibility can bridge that gap. So let me tell you about the one type of woman that spiritually awake men choose. Not because other women aren't valuable, not because other women aren't beautiful or intelligent or worthy, but because only one type can actually walk beside someone who's awake. Only one type can meet him where he actually is. I'm going to tell you something I've never said out loud, something that cost me years to understand. I used to think I wanted a certain type of woman. Beautiful, of course, successful, independent, someone who had her life together, someone impressive, someone who would look good on my arm and make other men jealous. And I found women like that, dated them, was in relationships with them, and every single time, no matter how good it looked from the outside, I felt this profound loneliness, this sense that I was performing, that I couldn't be fully myself, that I had to edit my thoughts, my beliefs, my entire way of seeing the world to make the relationship work. There was one woman in particular, let's call her Jessica, stunning, smart, ambitious, everything I thought I wanted. And for the first few months, it was exciting, intense, passionate. But then the cracks started showing. I'd try to talk about something meaningful, something I was thinking about, some insight I'd had about the nature of reality or consciousness or the illusions we live by. And she'd look at me like I was speaking another language. She'd nod politely, make supportive sounds. But her eyes were empty. She didn't get it, couldn't get it, wasn't interested in getting it. And slowly, I started to edit myself, started to only talk about surface things, started to perform the version of myself that she could understand, the successful guy, the fun guy, the guy who didn't think too deeply about things. And I was dying inside, because the real me, the awakened me, the me that had seen beyond the veil, that person had no place in the relationship. That person had to be hidden, suppressed, denied. You see, the spiritually awake can't be with someone who lives on the surface, who's obsessed with appearances, who measures worth by external markers, who's constantly performing for an invisible audience. Because once you've awakened, once you've understood that most of what society values is meaningless, you can't participate in that game anymore. You can't pretend that status matters, that image matters, that keeping up with anyone matters. And if your partner is still playing that game, if she's still measuring her worth by her Instagram likes or her career title or what other people think of her, you'll be fundamentally incompatible. Not because she's bad, but because you're operating from entirely different value systems. The awakened man needs a woman who's real. Not real in the sense of being unpolished or unambitious, but real in the sense that she's not performing, she's not wearing a mask. She's not pretending to be anything other than what she actually is. Can I be honest with you? This is rare, extremely rare. Most people, men and women alike, are so deeply conditioned by society, so committed to their persona, so invested in their image, that they've lost contact with who they actually are. They don't even know there's a difference between their authentic self and the role they're playing. And you can feel this immediately when you meet someone. You can sense whether they're present or performing, whether they're being or pretending, whether there's depth beneath the surface or if the surface is all there is. The awakened man is looking for that depth, that presence, that authenticity, and he won't settle for less, not because he's picky, but because he can't. Because pretending to be satisfied with superficiality would require him to go back to sleep. And once you've awakened, you can't choose unconsciousness. Not anymore. Here's something else. The spiritually awake Choose a woman who's done her own work, who's faced her shadows, who's confronted her patterns, who's willing to look at herself honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. Because awakening isn't just about understanding the world differently. It's about understanding yourself differently. It's about recognizing your conditioning, your wounds, your defense mechanisms, your ego's strategies, and being willing to work with them rather than being controlled by them. And if you're with someone who hasn't done this work, who's still being run by unconscious patterns, who's still acting out childhood wounds, who's still projecting her unresolved issues onto you, the relationship becomes exhausting. It becomes a battlefield of triggers and reactions and drama. I watched this happen with someone I knew. A man named Michael, awakened guy, deep thinker. But he fell for a woman who was beautiful and exciting but completely unconscious of her patterns, and their relationship was chaos. She'd get triggered by something, some innocuous comment or action, and she'd explode. Not because of what he'd actually done, but because of something from her past, some unhealed wound, some unconscious pattern. And she couldn't see it, couldn't take responsibility for it, just reacted and blamed him. And he tried. God, he tried. He tried to have conscious conversations about what was happening, try to create space for awareness, try to help her see her patterns. But she wasn't ready, wasn't willing, was too defended to look at herself honestly. And eventually, he had to leave. Not because he didn't love her, but because you can't have a conscious relationship with an unconscious person. You can't create depth with someone who refuses to go deeper. You can't be spiritually awake together if only one of you is awake. The awakened man also needs a woman who values growth over comfort, who's willing to be uncomfortable if that's what transformation requires, who doesn't cling to safety at the expense of evolution. Because spiritual awakening is not a destination, it's a process, an ongoing journey of seeing more clearly, understanding more deeply, becoming more conscious. And that process is often uncomfortable. It requires you to question everything, to let go of identities you've held, to face truths you've avoided, to change in ways that might not make sense to people around you. And if your partner is committed to comfort, if she needs everything to stay stable and predictable, if she resists change and clings to what's familiar, you'll be constantly at odds. You'll be growing and she'll be pulling you back. You'll be evolving and she'll be asking you to stay the same. This creates a specific kind of spiritual exhaustion, because you're not just managing your own resistance to growth, you're managing hers too. You're having to either slow down your evolution to keep pace with her comfort zone, or you're having to grow alone, creating increasing distance in the relationship. I knew a woman once, Sarah. She seemed spiritually minded, talked about growth, read the books, went to the workshops. But when her partner actually started to change, when he started questioning things they'd built their life around, she panicked. She didn't want real transformation. She wanted spiritual comfort. She wanted to feel like she was growing without actually having to change anything fundamental. And when growth became real, became uncomfortable, became threatening to the life they'd constructed, she shut it down. She gave him an ultimatum: stop changing or lose the relationship. And he chose growth. Because for the awakened person, spiritual evolution isn't optional. It's not something you can turn on and off based on what's convenient. It's a calling, a necessity, a fundamental orientation toward truth. Here's another thing. The spiritually awake choose a woman who can be present, who can be in the moment without constant distraction, without needing to fill every silence, without always being somewhere else mentally, even when she's physically there. Because presence is rare. Most people are lost in thought, replaying the past, rehearsing the future, planning, worrying, analyzing. They're never actually here, never actually now. And you can feel it. You can feel the absence even when they're sitting right next to you. But the awakened man has tasted presence. He knows what it feels like to be fully here, to be in this moment completely, to experience life directly rather than through the filter of thought. And once you've experienced that, once you know what real presence feels like, you can't pretend anymore. You can't settle for relationships that are just two people occupying the same space while being lost in their own minds. Can I tell you something? I once had a conversation with someone that changed how I understood connection. We were just sitting, not doing anything, not trying to impress each other, not performing, just present. And in that presence, there was more intimacy than I'd felt in years of relationships that were always busy, always distracted, always somewhere else. That's what the awakened person is looking for. Not someone who can entertain them, not someone who can fill every moment with activity, but someone who can be, someone who can sit in silence without it being awkward, someone who can be fully present without needing constant stimulation. This is a quality that goes beyond personality or interests or compatibility. It's about consciousness itself, about whether someone has the capacity to drop out of their mind and into the moment. And if they don't have that capacity, if they're always thinking, always planning, always somewhere else, there can be connection on many levels, but not on the deepest one. The awakened man also chooses a woman who's not looking for him to complete her, who doesn't need him to fill some void inside her, who comes to the relationship already whole, already complete, already at peace with herself. Because the awakened person understands something fundamental, that you can't find yourself in someone else, that no relationship can heal your wounds or fill your emptiness or make you feel worthy. That's inner work. That's your responsibility. And if you're bringing that need into a relationship, you're not looking for a partner, you're looking for a savior. And the awakened man can smell this immediately. He can sense when a woman is looking for him to fix her, complete her, save her. And it's exhausting, because he knows that's not possible. He knows that whatever hole she's trying to fill with him will never be filled, that he'll pour himself into that void and it will never be enough. I watched someone fall into this trap, a man named James. He met a woman who seemed perfect, but she needed him constantly, needed his validation, his attention, his reassurance. She couldn't be okay without him, couldn't feel good about herself without his approval, couldn't function without his presence. And at first, he felt needed, important, like he mattered. But over time, it became suffocating, because her need was bottomless. No matter how much he gave, it was never enough. She always needed more reassurance, more validation, more proof that he loved her. And he realized that he wasn't in a relationship. He was in a rescue mission. And you can't build a partnership with someone who sees you as their salvation rather than their equal. The awakened man wants a woman who's already whole, who's already done the work of learning to be okay with herself, who brings wholeness to the relationship rather than emptiness. Because only two whole people can create something that's more than the sum of its parts. Only two people who don't need each other can truly choose each other. Here's something else that matters deeply. The spiritually awake choose a woman who respects his need for solitude, who understands that his desire to be alone sometimes isn't rejection. It's necessity. It's how he maintains his connection to himself, to his depth, to his awareness. Because awakening requires space, silence, time alone, time to integrate, to process, to simply be without the constant input of another person. And if your partner interprets your need for solitude as abandonment, if she takes it personally, if she needs constant togetherness to feel secure, the relationship becomes a prison. The unawakened woman often views a man's need for space as a problem, as evidence that something's wrong with the relationship, as a threat to the connection. But the awakened woman understands that solitude isn't the opposite of intimacy, it's the foundation of it. That you can only truly connect with another when you haven't lost connection with yourself. Can I be honest with you? I've lost relationships over this. Women who couldn't understand why I needed time alone, who felt threatened by my meditation practice, my need for silence, my desire to sometimes just be without constant interaction. They'd say things like, if you really loved me, you'd want to spend all your time with me, as if love was measured by the absence of solitude rather than the quality of presence. But the awakened person knows better, knows that healthy separation is what allows for healthy connection, that you need space to return to yourself so you can show up fully for another. That constant togetherness, without space for solitude, doesn't create closeness. It creates codependence. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the spiritually awake choose a woman who has her own relationship with truth, who seeks it, who values it above comfort, who's willing to see what's real even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. Because awakening is fundamentally about truth, about seeing clearly, about recognizing what's real beneath the layers of conditioning and belief and story. And if you're with someone who's more committed to comfort than truth, who would rather maintain illusions than face reality, who gets defensive when confronted with something that challenges her worldview, you can't truly share your inner life with her. The awakened man has seen beyond the cultural narratives, the societal programming, the consensual hallucinations that most people mistake for reality. And he can't pretend he hasn't seen what he's seen. Can't go back to believing things he knows aren't true. And if his partner is still invested in those illusions, still attached to those narratives, still defending those beliefs, they're living in different worlds. They might share a house, share a bed, share a life on the surface. But at the deepest level, they're fundamentally alone. Because she can't see what he sees, and he can't unsee it to meet her where she is. I knew someone who tried to make this work, tried to be with someone who was beautiful, loving, supportive in many ways, but who simply couldn't go where he needed to go, who couldn't question what he needed to question, who couldn't see what he could see. And he described it as living in parallel realities, like he was experiencing life through one lens and she through another. And there was no bridge, no way to truly meet. And eventually, the loneliness of that became unbearable. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being with someone and still feeling completely unseen. So what does all this add up to? What is this one type of woman that the spiritually awake choose? She's authentic. She's done her inner work. She values growth over comfort. She can be present. She comes to the relationship whole. She respects his need for solitude. And she has her own relationship with truth. She's not common. She's not easy to find. Because all of these qualities require something that most people aren't willing to give. They require consciousness, awareness, the willingness to look at yourself honestly and grow even when it's uncomfortable. But she exists. And when the awakened man finds her, when he meets a woman who can match his depth, who can walk beside him in conscious partnership, who can be both separate and together, both independent and intimate, both strong and vulnerable, everything changes. Not because the relationship is perfect, but because it's real, because there's no pretending, no performing, no masks, just two people seeing each other clearly and choosing each other anyway, two people navigating life with awareness rather than unconsciousness, two people growing together rather than just coexisting. And this is what the spiritually awake are looking for. Not because they're picky or judgmental or impossible to please, but because they've tasted what real connection feels like. They've experienced what it means to be truly seen. And once you've experienced that, once you know what's possible, you can't settle for less. Not tomorrow, not someday, not when you get desperate or lonely or tired of being alone. You wait. You remain true to what you know. You trust that the right person exists. And when she appears, when you meet someone who can match your consciousness, your depth, your commitment to truth, you'll know, not because it's easy, not because it's perfect, but because finally, after all the relationships that felt like performance, you can just be yourself. And she can too. And together, you're more awake than you ever were alone.